Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 25th of October and today's video will be looking at a broad range of updates beginning with the area in southern Donetsk. We're going to look at minor change on Pobjeda, also of course Hirnyk, Valve Riverfront, Selydove, so many updates over there. We're going to look northwards at actually some localized movements around Toretsk, which I was not able to cover in earlier videos. Around the Luhansk Donetsk border, there are a few really important updates in the direction of the Jerebets River as well. And as you go north, there's also some clarification to be done around Kursk. So I'm going to look really in depth at some of the footage coming out of there and clarify order of battle and the front line. And also, I really do apologize, but my Wi-Fi connection is absolutely horrible. The only thing keeping it afloat is the fact that I have a hotspot. And I really hope that Elon Musk could send me some Starlink because I desperately need it. But that's why the video really looks grainy, so there's nothing I can do about that. I really apologize. But let's actually get into the frontline updates, which begin with some unconfirmed reports of a large-scale Russian advance into Shakhtartske. So far, what's coming out from the Russian side is that they've been able to advance at maximum 5 kilometers along this paved route that, again, you could look at its location, branches out vertically from Zolotaniva. And it is a very logical vector of advance, even though we don't have proof of it yet, because you can see that it is an area that really does lack density of fortifications. And is just great given the fact that the Russian forces already do have the momentum here, utilizing armored columns to push along the highway from Pechistivka to Zolotaniva. So it is a logical extension for them to continue advancing northwards and break through the 5 kilometer line and reach this local Ukrainian defense hub. And it is an important hub because, again, the paved roads that branch out either to the west or to the east. To the east, you do have the opportunity to then advance and flank Novokrainka, flank Bohoyavlenka, and arrive all the way to the really important logistical hub of Uspenivka. So that's a part of the longer-term calculus when it comes to advancing to Shakhtartske. Then also, if you look westwards, it gives you another opportunity to flank Velika Novosilka. Right now, the Russians have a very important route leading directly into the southeastern outskirts, and that would really just be an icing on the cake. More generally, the fact of the matter is you don't have that much Ukrainian focus and emphasis on building up defenses in the southern Donetsk fronts in a horizontal manner. You can see that there are a lot of vertical defenses that were built further eastwards in relation to Krakow, especially around the perimeter of that city, but there was not an expectation based on the way that the Ukrainians built these defenses over the past year, beginning actually in November of 2023, that they would be facing these head-on attacks from the south. And you can see that manifests with the extent of the defenses, which are, sort of present around this chain of villages, making it all the way to Uspenivka. But then as you go westwards, you see that this region in the hinterlands between Velika Novosilka and I guess you could say Bohoyavlenka, this 25-kilometer piece of territory, it's just not that well defended, whether it be in terms of the troop concentration, which we've talked about in detail in previous videos. But you can see, of course, a lot of them on my map, primarily held by the 58th Motorized Brigade. And also in terms of the static defenses, you just don't have that many. You have that 5-kilometer line, which the Russians are seemingly trying to break through at the moment. And after that, you just have a large swaths of open fields before you reach the next large-scale Ukrainian defense line, which, if we're going to measure it, is about, I guess, 15 kilometers northwards and actually arrives at Andriivka, which is Ukraine's largest remaining logistical hub in southern Donetsk, and one that is now rapidly approaching an area where the Russian, I suppose, mid-range artillery will be able to begin striking it. And that is a really important fear that the Ukrainians have to keep in mind. The fact that they're going to now have added pressure coming in from shelling, not just of Andriivka, but of all the roads branching out of it. And then you have, of course, the feasibility of a Russian attack coming in from the south, putting pressure not just from the east, but also from the south. And you could see how that can manifest given the few roads that are paved, making their way all the way up to Andriivka, but also just the lack of defenses and vast open fields. So that is something that definitely the Russians are keeping an eye on, and it would all really get kickstarted via Shakhtartske. For the moment, Russian sources are claiming the advance is moderate in terms of gains, that there should not be talk about major success yet, but the Russians are heading in that direction. The Ukrainians do have a HIMARS system operating around here. They have pions that are firing towards the Russian side of the border, but the Russians claim to have destroyed a pion actually in this same sector, but they are claiming that they were able to advance at least several kilometers along this paved route. So definitely over the next 24 hours, keep an eye out for what the Ukrainians acknowledge about that development. Now, when it comes to Pobjeda, this is an area of the front line that has not been as active. But you can see here a Russian advance amounting to 4.8 square kilometers. You could also see here the geolocation. It comes from the 33rd Mechanized Brigade. The unit has recently really reactivated, at least in terms of the videos that it's posting. They have these very large cyclical nature when it comes to the posting of footage. So they had a very long period of time in the summer where there wasn't as much posted, but right now they appear to be very active, whether it be just south of Hirnyk and south of the highway, putting a lot of pressure onto the Russian columns from the 150th Division and from the 5th Tank Brigade that are continuing to advance in the western direction over here towards the eastern outskirts of Kursk. That is, of course, occurring. At the same time, though, they're providing defensive cover for the groupings that are really holding on to these trench systems just west of Pobjeda. You can see the Russians have now successfully taken over a large chunk of those static defenses, and that's a big part of what the Russians are trying to achieve here. So Pobjeda acts as their forward hub of attack, and they also have the local highway that comes in from Marinka. So then the armored forces, they branch out, take this rightward turn from Pobjeda, make their way to the tree lines, dismount forces there. The vehicles withdraw. The forces are supposed to really remain there seated overnight and eventually build a solid base to expand even deeper. So then that's when you have the 33rd come in with a lot of its heavy equipment, including the Leopard 2A4. So in this video, it just fires towards the tree lines. And the furthest extent of that indicates that there was a Russian advance that really pushed through a lot of these trenches, which is important at a really extent of 3 kilometers westwards. So that is important because you do have this large swath of open territory in between the current line of contact and the Ukrainian trench perimeter of Kursk. In that region, there's a question as to whether it will be able to hold on its own, because right now the Ukrainian focus is so split between various sectors and corridors northwards. Also, of course, dealing with attacks southwards around populated villages. And so then everything in between, it becomes really exposed, and those areas are actually on slightly higher elevation, which overlooks all 3 directions where there's currently fighting. It overlooks the fighting to the north over here near Kursk. It looks the potential Ukrainian trenches that are going to be coalesced around to the west over here where I'm hovering with my mouse. And then also to the south, it overlooks the chain of villages where you see the current fighting around Katerynivka and Ilinka. So those regions will, of course, all be exposed if you have this deep Russian salient that begins to expand. And that's why you do need the 33rd Brigade to counteract those such attacks. So definitely keep an eye out for that. This region is an open area, and it's definitely one that could be exposed in the future. Now, looking around Hirnyk, the Russian sources claim a substantial advance occurred today in the northeastern part of the town, looking something like this. This advance would entail a Russian advance that got control over a lot of the duplexes, even the local hospital, stores, park. When you add it up together, it would be 45% of all of Hirnyk, which would mean the Ukrainians are only in, definitive control over the landfill over here, the mine facility nearby, the private residential areas over here, the sort of city center, which coalesces over here, is either in a gray zone or under control of the Ukrainian forces. And then the southwestern portion is the strongest region for the Ukrainians. So again, you're seeing how the Russians, due to putting so much pressure from several axes, meant that there was less Ukrainian resistance focused on holding on to the northern portions of the town, which allowed the Russians to come in, establish a solid base of operations, and now they're expanding from there along some of the key roads that run vertically through Hirnyk, also, of course, along the rail axis. Based on the publicly available information, a lot of it is occurring in the less dense regions of Hirnyk to the west, but of course, the Russians are claiming that it looks something like this, so we're going to have to see what the Ukrainians allege about that. And then at the same time, it would put the remaining Ukrainian squads, every small squads that are operating near this trench line and on the sort of western bank of the Vovcha River, in a very precarious situation, so they would be forced to retreat. And more broadly, the implications of losing Hirnyk would be that Kursk would be under extreme pressure because it already is receiving a lot of harassment from the east, from Zoriana, and then imagine that compounded by Russian attacks by the newly galvanized 110th Motorized Rifle Brigade coming in from the north. So you have the battalions from the Presidential Brigade, like the 21st Battalion operating here. You do have territorial defense units. You have one of the most experienced units being the 59th Brigade, and there are several battalions like the 9th, 10th, and 11th around here. So they're really putting up the fight and trying to hold on despite the very significant Russian pressure unfolding from several axes, one of which is in between Novoselidivka and Ismailivka. And this is an area where Ukrainian sources over the past 24 hours have acknowledged the advances that we talked about with the Russian entrance into Ismailivka, with the Russian expansion in between these two villages in this X over here, and then actually reaching Novoselidivka itself. So there's not any confirmed information from this salient yet, but again, it is one of the most threatening Russian bulges at the moment because of its proximity to the Kurakova reservoir, which could really create the conditions to squeeze the Ukrainians out of the Kurakova or Hirnyk salient entirely. Because again, 5 kilometers, that's well within the FPV range to begin striking all of the supply lines, all of the Ukrainian defenses here. So really, I think we're going to see that activated as the FPV crews, they make their way towards the St. Basil mine and use that as their sort of organization points, not just for the area south, but also for the area to the west around Novoselidivka, Voznesenka, Kremina Balka. And speaking of Kremina Balka, Russian sources allege that they've been able to infiltrate into the eastern outskirts of this village along the rail axis, which starts in Tokornia. This is why the village of Tokornia was so important for the Russians to capture. It gives them the first really launching pad to then begin advancing west of the rail line and into an area of Donetsk that is relatively open, that is less dense, and it really presents a lot of opportunities for the Russians to exploit Ukrainian weaknesses on the rear. One such example would be the Russian expansion westwards from Sokornia. Right now, it amounts to, at the minimum, what is this, 0.8 square kilometers, but it could actually be an even larger advance by the Russian forces into the eastern outskirts of Novodmitrivka. And this is an area that really was not expecting to come under intense bombardment and ground assaults this early on. Right now, a certain portion of it is in a gray zone, whereas others are under Ukrainian control. And the Ukrainians are about, I suppose, or Russians are about 3 kilometers away from fully taking over Novodmitrivka. You can see there is a paved route that directly connects between Selydove, and as you go southwards all the way to Andrivka, it is a route that is used for really important coordination between these two defense nodes. But of course, we know the Russians cut it off via the rail axis, as was reported by Petrenko today. And so this road, it no longer has the purpose of connecting Selydove to Andrivka, but of course, it could still be utilized to connect Andrivka to several other frontline villages that are smaller in scale. And one of them would be Novodmitrivka. And also, this is probably an area where you have the rear positions of the 59th Brigade's Tank Battalion, which has been moved into this region to provide some sort of fabric to really push back against Russian offensives. And they were involved in a lot of clashes in Tokornia, but were pushed back. So now they're going to be on sort of the back foot, really trying to hold on to their positions here. And the reason I say this is because, again, there's just a complete lack of density in the defenses here. You look at it, there's one horizontal line, which actually could have been useful if the Russian attack was coming in from the south. But the Russians could largely avoid having to, isolate these trenches, go in and clear them one by one because they're advancing, coming in from the eastern direction. And then they just don't even have to consider it in their equation when they begin attacks. And then as a natural result of the Ukrainians losing the nearby positions in populated areas, they end up not even resisting in these trenches. And then they actually have an adverse effect because the Russians go into them, they feel more protected, and then they really use those underground or semi-underground routes to really hop from trench to trench and take them over entirely in very fast manners. That's something that happened when the Russians crossed over the Vovcha River and took advantage of the trench system there that was not utilized properly by the Ukrainians. And it's something that could also occur around here. And it's something that will have implications not just for the area to the south around Kurakove, which would be under a lot of pressure from the supply lines that sort of feed into it from Andrivka, but it would also have implications more generally for the Ukrainian defense in southern Donetsk, including the rear of Selydove. The rear of Selydove really consists of a lot of small villages along rail lines that are on valleys and then connect to the city itself. They are not that well defended when it comes to trenches built around them, and then they're small in size each individually, so you could very easily isolate them and then engage in fierce clashes one by one. And that's something the Russians, of course, have done extensively in this region with a lot of their village hopping campaigns conducted by the 110th 114th Motor Rifle Brigade. And the manifestation of that would be the fear that the Russians would be able to reach all the way to the Novo-Olenivka and Novo-Troitska line, this vertical line, which is being built by the Ukrainians right now as a stopgap to prevent the Russians from reaching the border between Donetsk and Dnipro. That is sort of the broader fear here. And this is why the Ukrainians, they're also resisting so fiercely in Selydove. Even after the initial withdrawal from the east, there's no indication yet that they're going to withdraw from the west, because Selydove acts as one of those really final massive strongholds before the Russians are able to reach an area of Donetsk that has less trenches, that has less urban sort of settlements, and has just in its wake large amount of open fields that are conducive for Russian armored assaults and dismounts of troops and tree lines. That would be the big fear, and that's why we're going to zoom in right now on Selydove. Ukrainian sources acknowledge that probably the front line is even more favorable for the Russians than I have marked on my map, so I'm going to have to change it to indicate that the Russians are even closer to Vishneve. They are really having a field day advancing along these windbreaks and then putting pressure onto the rear of Selydove. That is true, of course. And then looking at the city itself, you could see further Russian advances west of the hospital, getting into some of the private residential areas. The St. Nicholas Temple was taken over by them. It's an advance amounting to 0.8 square kilometers, and it also runs sort of adjacent to the Solona River in this particular case. You do still have a certain Ukrainian force that is resisting in southern Selydove, but some Russian sources actually claim that this region in red, this sort of red rectangle, is under Russian control by now. And so their mapping of the situation is even more in favor of Russia than mine. I think mine may actually be one of the most conservative estimates of Russian advances. That's in part because of connection issues that really prevent me from making substantial changes at once, but also just because I'm trying to be cautious with the updates over here. Then to the north, here you have a lot of mapping based on Petrenko. So that's a Ukrainian source indicating that the Russians were able to push through one of the more dense sections of the city, which includes dozens of apartments, high-rise buildings with these concrete slabs. And just imagine that these regions, if the Russians had not been able to put pressure from several axes and break the Ukrainian line, they would have been fought over individually, like we're seeing in Toretsk, to yield really large casualties in the process. And now the Russians are largely avoiding that by very quickly storming them and then establishing a perimeter nearby, preventing Ukrainians from counterattacking. And I don't think the Ukrainians are really thinking about it right now. I think their first goal is to create a stabilization measure, because the gray zone marked by Petrenko is actually larger than mine. The gray zone marked by Petrenko includes a lot of these private residential areas that are not as dense, and it sort of extends all the way into the western portions of the city. And so the Ukrainians first have to think about how they're going to be able to establish a really steady line of support, reinforcements, equipment, logistics, of course, and then also where are the strong points where they can continue to hold on. Because you can see another strong point, the Korochenka mine, is now being taken over by the Russians. They advanced here, taking over a large section, but not all of it. The northern part is still not under their full control, but this means the Russians are setting up positions on the highest elevated area in this entire battlefield, which will provide them with amazing fire and vantage points to attack the remaining Ukrainian forces in this sort of dense region of northern Selydove. This is an area where some Russian sources claim to have already started assaulting the outskirts from this direction over here, but I can't confirm this vector of attack. This area has large amount of duplexes and apartments, not as much as the Solona city center, but still it is a substantial amount of structures that would be important for dragging out fighting. Based on the reporting from the Ukrainian side, the Russian forces are closing in on the Shakhtar Stadium, on the local park, and on a lot of these the various neighborhoods and complexes that connect it all together. Now, to look north of Novohordivka, here we have proof that the Ukrainians are actually in control of more territory than was previously imagined. This is based on a video that I have marked here and was geolocated on October 24th of a Russian squad throwing explosives into a Ukrainian position in northern Novohordivka, the northern mine, sorry. It's called Novohordivka number 3, I believe. And it's an area that includes the mine shaft, of course, which is currently split. Some Russian forces are operating there, and they're trying to expel the Ukrainians from the remaining areas, including the Terrakhon. And it's very important that the Ukrainians remain in control of this strong point, because it sort of drags out the fighting and prevents the Russians from focusing northwards on the large swath of open fields before reaching the defensive line. That, of course, knocks on the southern outskirts of Mirnorod. So the Ukrainians do remain here. The 93rd Brigade really is providing a lot of support and really pushing back against Russian attacks. Even though there is a high cost, the 93rd Brigade individual soldiers talked about how they were pushed back from, or not necessarily them, but they engaged in clashes here within the northern parts of Novohordivka, which led to 300 Russian soldiers, they said, being killed or seriously injured. So they're definitely fighting a really drawn out battle here. The thing is, this position is still exposed and is really the final one where the Ukrainians could put up resistance east of the line of defense that we've been talking about extensively, spanning from Hordivka all the way southwards to Sukhyar. To look at New York and Toretsk, there are a few changes that we need to discuss over here. First off, you have this very minor Russian advance that occurred northwest of New York. The Russians do have this very interesting salient that continues expanding, and I've talked about it in detail previously, but it is really a part of dual strategy. First of all, trying to eliminate any sort of Ukrainian static defense in this vertical line that runs near Petrivka, Leonidivka, really trying to prevent the Ukrainians from using that eventually as a fallback line once they lose control over the villages along the rail line. That's just one strategy, but also, of course, creating this flanking opportunity to getting control of higher elevated areas that will be able to fire upon Sukhabalka and all the positions and defense, really fortresses, really, that are located on the highway connecting them together horizontally. So that's, I believe, why the Russians are advancing in those regions. To look at the Ukrainians, they conducted 2 localized counterattacks in this region, and it's not necessarily something that happened overnight. It's a drawn-out process, and it's one that I should have caught notice of. The fact that I didn't catch wind of it is actually my fault, and I wasn't looking and paying attention too close to the situation here, and that's probably why. But you can see in the Zabalka district of Toretsk that the Ukrainians were able to retake 0.6 square kilometers of territory based on footage released by both sides, including a lot of Russian videos targeting the Ukrainian forces that were advancing, which is how we even know that they attacked here and were able to really gain some favorable positions in the first place. So here you can see October 23rd, Russian FPVs to hit Ukrainians in an apartment and just more generally private residential areas in Zabalka. Here's another video. This is from the October 25th incident of a Russian FPV hitting a Ukrainian M113 as probably while it was still carrying troops. So the M113 came in from the west, came from the Terrakon, dropped top forces here in the houses. They set up camp in the basements, and then from there expanded outwards, expanded eastwards, of course, towards the center of Zabalka, but also you had Ukrainians coming in from the south, coming in from positions in the final district of Zabalka that had control over previously, and attacking northwards, solidifying control over large complexes. You'll have some stores here, dentists. Zabalka is sort of split right now because the Russians are still in control of the northern section, which includes the soccer pitch, includes some of the less dense and less large in stature structures of Zabalka. And it is really an imperative of the Ukrainians to, at the very least, maintain this as a status quo because it gives them a bit of breathing space. Because the Russians getting control over Zabalka will really undermine Ukraine's entire defense in Toretsk because it would give them a really good window to begin attacking the largest landfills that are providing amazing vantage points for the Ukrainians in this urban battle. So for now, I believe that's why they sent in reinforcements to here, and they noticed the Russians were sort of taking their gas off the pedal over here for a couple of weeks, and then that's when they were able to pounce and push back, of course, under the Russian return fire, which is very heavy. And you can see something very similar manifest in the center of Toretsk, based on a lot of footage that came out in analysis from OSINT, sort of people that were keeping track of what's going on, that the geolocations that I've been talking about very extensively of Russian forces being attacked by Ukrainians in the center of Toretsk. A lot of those videos have been cascading out recently. They're actually old. They come from the end of September based on satellite imagery showing that there was very similar damage to the same geolocations around that time period. And that in actuality, the Ukrainians really beginning in early October all the way until now, over these past 2 weeks, have been conducting this operation to clear out the Russians from the citadel of Toretsk. And in the end, it was able to establish an advance, a very minor advance of 30 hectares, but it's more so about the targets that were taken over. So I'm just going to click through some footage and see if it matches and actually really is related to what we're talking about. So you have Ukrainian infantry dismounting from an M113. They threw a TM62 charge into apartments in Toretsk. Really, you're seeing in a lot of these urban conflicts either TMK2s or TM62 mines that are then in the iteration of a explosive charge that is thrown into a apartment or into a building, and the yield is just so large that it causes a large portion of the walls to cave in on themselves, and of course on any troops that are inside. So of course you have to come in and throw it very quickly and run away, and that's what we see in a lot of these videos. And it's sort of a hit and run attack. Here you could also see this is from the 132nd Brigade DPR units. They shelled Ukrainians in Toretsk apartments. That shows that there was a relatively deep Russian, I suppose, Ukrainian advance. I suppose largest extent would be 700 meters southeastwards, and you could see that based on the available footage. What we have not been able to see yet is any indication of the Russians being pushed out of this section of the citadel. But you can see here large apartment buildings that were taken back by the Ukrainians, including at the heart of Toretsk. Meanwhile, the Russians do still maintain this foothold if they do intend to, in the near future, restart their attacks in this area. Now, looking at the Jerebets River front, here you have in large part the results of the 144th Motor Rifle Division putting so much pressure over an extended period of time towards the Ukrainian garrison here. And whenever there was a marginal advance, and there were many during the past year and a half, I always said that it was a part of a larger framework and plan for how the battle should unfold that would allow eventually for the Russians to get control over the eastern bank of the Jerebets River, get control of advantageous crossings, including villages entirely, but also bridges to go over the river and flank whatever remnants there were, like in Terny or Yampolivka right now. It's what we're actually beginning to see manifest. You can see it with two polygons. The one to the south indicates there was a large-scale Russian advance into Novosadove. Here you can see the largest extent of the Russian advance near this local ravine. It's from the 60th Brigade, this video, but it's just vehicular and artillery fire onto 3 Russian vehicles as they were pushing along the tree line towards Terny. And then also along a lot of these tree lines, you don't have paved roads, but you just have these paths and also ravines that have some great concealment. So the Russians use that in this specific example to make it into Novosadove. You could see the geolocation to prove that. Here, October 27th, the Russians raised the flag in that village. And here you have even further south, the 67th Brigade, which is now actually joining the National Guard. They're leaving the armed forces of Ukraine, but they're still involved in the fighting here. And they conducted an FPV strike onto Russian forces that were able to make it even further south. And this is now an option for the Russians to hop from house to house, hop along the main road that bisects vertically here all the villages, and actually assault Terny head on from this northern axis instead of attacking from the east. From the east, this is an area where the Ukrainians are very active with drone crews. They already have troops that are embedded within the forested regions themselves. And so any advances here are very, very costly. But now you have a new option to divert attention and put more pressure from another axis. And the Russians, they're only like 3 kilometers away from taking over Terny in its entirety. And then you would only have Yampolivka. So you can see how this effort is really beginning to shape the battlefield in a way where the Jerebets River would no longer be a stepping stone for the Ukrainians, whereas it would be one for the Russians to cross over. And you can see that with how they've been focusing on Makivka recently. Now with Nevska being taken over, there's so many different crossings. Even if there isn't a bridge, for instance, the Jerebets River is so narrow in this part of the front line where the Russians advanced that they could actually afford to use pontoons or perhaps even cross over by foot. You can see here the Russian advances amounting to 10 square kilometers, and then here another polygon, and this was based on a geolocation, amounting to another size here. But you can see that all in all, it is because of the Russians coalescing, getting control over these large swaths of fields that were no longer under Ukrainian control. They cannot contest anymore. So the Ukrainian garrison from 60th, 63rd, I believe, 67th, etc., all of them had to cross over the river and are now establishing their local positions near these trench lines that you see built in the light yellow color. Now looking at Kursk, I'm going to give my best understanding of how the situation is at the moment. You have this video from the Borki, Plechova region. released by the Russian 810th Brigade and also the 382nd Regiment. So they conducted FPV strikes onto a Ukrainian vehicle to the east of said village. The Ukrainians do still maintain control over Plehovo as a forward outpost east of the Psel River. We all understand why. They don't want the Russians to reach the river, cross it over, and then provide a lot of pressure onto the logistics and Suja itself. That is completely understandable. And that's why you do have now Russian efforts to fight back, and not anything too large as of now, but definitely they are striking Plehovo, and they've really created circumstances that would be conducive for a future attack to enter into the village. It's just we haven't seen that offensive willpower just yet. Looking a bit to the north, you can see that I've been able to shuffle around the order of battle just slightly because I had some time on my hands, and so I added in additional units. So a good example of that would be the 143rd Motor Rifle Regiment, because they had definitely some presence around Zaporozhye. I believe the Orkiv sector, if I'm not mistaken, or perhaps even a bit further to the east near the Huliapoli region. It could be that area. But now they have, at the very least, a partial presence over here, just based on Russian social media posts discussing all of this. In terms of the latest minutia of advances, this is one that was not able to cover fully, but it was just the Russians advancing southeast of Kalynov. You do have several videos of Ukrainians being able to repel those assaults, very active drone crews over here, and Ukrainian vehicles coming in to push back. So here you have the 41st Brigade. They're heavily involved in the repulsion efforts. But it does show that the Russian forces are utilizing these large-scale forested areas to push closer and closer and really try to tighten the noose onto Pogrebki and nearby villages. Westwards, you can see the Russians have been able to capture all of Volgovka. This is something that was presumably the case for a while, but just was not proof of it. The Russians were able to advance 9.3 square kilometers based on this geolocation, and it shows that the Russian forces are in Olgovka itself. I want to click on the right location here, October 23rd, Russian Air Force Motor Rifle Regiment. They raised the flag. So again, these are Russian members of the VKS, and the unit was established, I believe, shortly before the entire Kursk offensive came into fruition, and they were in large parts responsible for holding out to Kuranovo, especially in the opening days. And then they received a lot of ancillary supports, and now they become in some ways the ancillary role for the VDV, but they still are active and engaged in a lot of frontline fighting. And now they've come sort of full circle by retaking Olgovka itself, and they're going to be probably involved with clearing out Kremyanoy, where we so far have not been able to receive any sort of solid indication of what's going on from either side. So I still have to keep it as a gray zone. To look further south at the highway that connects between Koranovo and Suja, and more so the region around Lyubimovka, Ukrainian forces understandably have been able to organize reinforcements. We'll get into some details in a second. A large amount of vehicles, tank companies being moved in, coalescing around this corridor that connects between, I suppose, the rail line west of Naidenov all the way to Kruglenkoy. This is a very important region for the Ukrainians, a strip of territory, 7 kilometers. They would like to broaden it out as much as possible, and I believe that would entail retaking Leonidovo and Alexandria. Right now, those two villages are in a gray zone because the Russians have failed to establish permanent settlement over there. Definitely in Novoivanovka, there is a strong Russian presence, but it could still be penetrated by the Ukrainians because, again, we're not talking about like huge walls being built around these front lines. They could be very flexible in cases where there may not be a large presence of Russian soldiers in a certain part of the settlement in a certain time of day, and then that's when the Ukrainians pounce on that, send in vehicles, and begin to try to take over. So we do have the video from October 21st confirming that the 47th Mechanized Brigade is back in full force. Previously, we knew that the Strike Drone Company was active, but now we also know that the Tank Battalion is operating here. They have the Abrams actually fighting over here, as you may have recalled, and engaged in direct fire towards Russian houses in Novoivanovka. Since then, there's not been any additional proof of the Ukrainians within the settlement, so I'm not going to change the marking based off of that one video when no Ukrainian sources have as of yet. You can see that the route that the Ukrainians are using to engage in fighting and put a lot of pressure onto this Russian salient to prevent it from expanding is being done through this highway, which then leads to Zeleny Shleich and to Novoivanovka. So you do have a lot of fierce clashes going on in this X over here. This has become a gray zone. It's been a really tough arena. Both sides are engaged in fights targeting the Russian side's BMPs, MTLBs, tanks that are operating here, troops that are dismounting. The Ukrainian side have very active drone crews. They have a lot of vehicles that are pushing through, as we've discussed, Western weaponry, also older ones, BTRs, BMPs being utilized by the Ukrainians. There's a wide array of units that are active around here, whether it be the 47th, whether it be the, I think it was 41st, whether it be the air assault units like the 80th, 82nd, 95th. They're all now involved in this large-scale effort to prevent a broader Russian penetration that could force the Ukrainians out of some of their most favorable positions in northern Kursk, which have, of course, all of the higher elevated areas and have all the means by which to exert pressure onto villages and towns that are deeper into Kursk Oblast. That is the entire thinking. They want to prolong this and try to maintain control over what could be a vestige of hope in the future. And when I'm talking about the Ukrainian side, here you can see video from east of Obukhovka, Russian control over 1.8 square kilometers. You could see that in the video. Russian forces, they expand past that village and they dismount forces near a tree line. The Russian forces make it into the tree line, then the BMP-2 begins to leave, and as it's doing so, it runs over a mine, and that leads to very significant damage, completely destroying the tank, and of course the people inside of it suffered really grievous injuries, and also ones that were outside, people that were dismounted, they were injured and killed in other incidents. I believe it could just be the Ukrainians dropping grenades onto them, but it does indicate at the very least that this region is no longer occupied by the Ukrainians. Further indication that the Russians are really trying to take their time, that they don't have the desire to go in very quickly and push into these regions, or at the very least release footage of it, because this is still an active area, very fluid. The Ukrainians have withdrawn to Nizhny Klin. Darino, according to some Russian sources, is already in a gray zone, so that has to be monitored. But again, we do not have enough of a deep confirmation of Russian presence in Pokrovsky. We're beginning to see more indications that the Russians are in Tolstoy Lug because of Ukrainian tanks that are coming in from the 36th Brigade, Marine Brigade, along the Zeleny Shlych road, then sort of branching out to the west and firing towards the Russians operating in Tolstoy Lug. So we're just seeing the combination of a long, drawn-out process of the Russians, solidifying control in those regions. And then to look finally at the Glushkovo district, I made some adjustments to the map. We have not seen too much geolocated proof to go one way or the other about who's in control of certain settlements like Obukhovka, Veseloy, Medvedje, Obod, but the Ukrainian sources have sort of agreed that it fizzled out and that they're no longer as active on the Russian side of the border, with one exception based on video proof from the Russian side. This is from September, not this video, but there's a different video that was released by the Russian side, which shows 21st Brigade crossing over the international border into Novi Put, having their Kozak, I believe, getting destroyed. Or rather, the 106 VDV Division spotted a CV-90 cross over the border near a tract of Novi Put. Also killed, I believe, 2 Ukrainian soldiers in that operation and destroyed the CV-90. So that would be the furthest extent, most likely, of where the Ukrainians are, which is extremely close. And again, you're looking at true movements. 21st Brigade is probably one of the only ones left putting pressure in this area, as the vast majority of Ukrainian forces that were supposed to be involved in diversionary attacks have been moved back to engage in stabilization measures. So that's 47th Brigade, 116th Brigade. You could go on. And that's just the result now that the Ukrainians can't conduct the same sort of intensity in Glushkovo. So that's all that for today. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for sticking by despite the connection issues, which I always have. And I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.